Thanks for joining us in the Florida Today newsroom. I'm Matt Reed. Today we'll get a deeper look at two major crime stories from Brevard with exclusive insight from Florida Today reporter Andrew Ford. Ford recently broke the front page story about Marcus Royal, a man arrested for killing a woman during a home invasion in Rockledge last year. Royal then told police and prosecutors that he had murdered another woman in a case that police had long ago concluded was death by natural causes. How could police have missed? And given his record, how was Royal free in the first place? Also today, Ford shares an insider's view of the trial of Brandon Bradley, the man who murdered Deputy Barbara Pill and was sentenced to death. Ford covered the trial gavel to gavel. Was justice served? Later, I'll share how you can weigh in on these stories and others. But first, here's a look at Ford's video report from FloridaToday.com on two terrible deaths.
When Faye Jones, a 78-year-old Cocoa woman, was beaten to death in her home on March 17, 2013, it first appeared to be like any other case. The police soon suspected Marcus Royal, a 33-year-old former convict, and within days he turned himself in. But Royal surprised investigators with another admission. He said he strangled 73-year-old Ann Mull, a Rockledge woman, 2 years earlier under circumstances that were strikingly similar to the murder of Faye Jones. Startlingly, Rockledge police, the woman's doctor, and the medical examiner's office thought she died naturally. They'd attributed Mull's death to a heart attack. They didn't recognize a crime had been committed until Royal confessed. But now, as officials prosecute Royal for both murders, there are plenty of indicators. As a result of this oversight, they never looked for a killer, leaving Royal free to allegedly strike again. Rockledge Police Chief Joseph Lasada told Florida Today, quote, "We made the mistake, and it's on us." Lasada joined the force long after the incident and has changed some department procedures to guard against such mistakes in the future. These two murders were announced only this past December after a grand jury indicted Royal in Mull's death almost 3 years after she died. Since then, Florida Today has pieced together how her slaying in 2011 and Faye Jones's death in 2013 are connected. By reviewing police records, court videos, and conducting numerous interviews, we found that during the 2 years between the two murders, Royal was arrested 3 times and spent time in jail twice. Royal was also stopped 10 times on traffic violations, and he was a suspect, though not arrested, in a non-fatal assault on another elderly woman in her home. Finally, when Royal was sentenced to 3 months in jail for one of his crimes, he was let out early. Police say he killed Faye Jones the very next day.
Andrew, thanks for joining us here today. What kind of feedback have you gotten on these stories?
It's been really positive, actually, from inside the newsroom as well as out in the community. Let's say from the state attorney's office, a lot of people have given me high praise. Even though the Marcus Royal story was sort of critical of their office, Phil Archer took the time to say that he appreciated it. Rockledge Police Chief Joseph Lasada seemed to think it was pretty fair. So it's been a pretty good experience overall.
That's about the best you can hope for, is the people involved saying it was fair. It was certainly compelling reading. What struck me in reading the story about Marcus Royal, like a lot of people, he had a pretty extensive criminal record.
Sure.
And the upshot of this was that he might not have been out to commit the second killing and home invasion had he been tripped up somewhere else along the way. Was there a type of case or type of incident that might have put him back into prison or back into jail or something that you came across?
Well, he had a number of run-ins in between these two alleged murders, violations of probation as well as the crimes themselves. I think there was a theft in there, driving on a suspended license, but none of those would have justified putting a man in prison for life.
They were violations of probation, but they weren't capital offenses.
Are you going to put a man in prison for life for driving on a suspended license? As I understand the circumstances, he was working at a used car dealership, and he moved one of the cars around from like the front lot to the back, and very briefly went on city streets and happened to get pulled over right at that moment. So, is that something that you'd put a person in prison for life?
I see. So he has been arrested for this 2013 home invasion and killing. Any idea or sense of what motivated him to confess the other one?
Really, I don't. I have no idea. I know it came right about the time that he got back into Brevard County. I believe, I'd have to check my notes to be certain, but I think he contacted Rockledge Police right the same day he was brought back. If you remember, he had fled out of state.
Right.
He was then turned himself in there, and they brought him back, and it was that day that he confessed.
So he turned himself in for one and then confessed to the other as well.
Right.
Well, it sounds like somebody who wanted to atone in some fashion, or at least he knew that something was coming.
I can only speculate.
Yeah. The now murder of it was Ann Mull in 2011, correct?
Right.
Describe that scene a little bit. I mean, here was a crime. Well, they didn't know it was a crime scene. They had an unattended death. What did they see at this scene versus what Royal said that he did later on?
Right, well, it's actually kind of hard to describe because not very much evidence was collected. No photos were taken of her at the time. As I understand it, the police thought it was that they had a natural death in their hands. They find this woman in her underwear on the floor in her house.
Not uncommon for an unattended death from somebody
Perhaps,
who's got problems.
They speak to her doctor, who says he's willing to sign off on a death certificate, saying that she had died of a heart attack. Then they call the medical examiner, explain that they've got the doctor willing to sign the death certificate, and he says, well, that all sounds fine, releases the case. Then, as I recall, they had a removal service come and take her body out of the home. Later, there's this process where they have to get approval for a cremation, and based on the death certificate and police saying everything looks fine, the medical examiner signs off, says, okay, go ahead and cremate her.
So procedurally, all these steps happen, but somewhere along the way, there wasn't any kind of. It didn't sound like they did an autopsy. They didn't do a close physical examination.
Right. Basically, as far as I understand it, most everything went according to protocol, as you would expect it, except kind of for this initial oversight of the police response when they find this woman dead in her home.
Okay. Later on, I mean, 2 years later,
Sure.
Marcus Royal confesses. What does he say that he did in this case?
From what I can remember of his arrest document, he said he broke into her house by kind of reaching in through a dog door and unlocking from the inside a side door to her garage.
I see.
Sneaks in, wakes her up by hitting her with a gun, drags her out into her hallway, and strangled her, is what it says in the report.
Wow. That's pretty violent.
It is, and I think there might have been additional details of
Kicking her.
hitting her, stepping on her, yeah,
Okay.
something like that as well, which you might expect to leave marks, but apparently not.
Wow. Okay, so.
Which, by the way, the medical examiner says is not typical, but possible.
It's not typical, but possible. And so he reaches into the door. There's no sign of a forced entry. He didn't break glass and kick
Right.
in the door or anything. So
Right.
there wasn't signs of a break-in.
The house appeared safe and secure.
Wow. Wow. Okay, so if there was something that could have been done differently that did, or something that could have happened differently but did not,
Well,
what do you think? What are people saying should have happened or could have happened?
Rockledge police policy used to be that they would send an investigator to every death.
Okay.
And then I think it was 2009, the former police chief, Shockey, changed that and said that on nights and weekends, patrol guys can handle apparent natural deaths,
Okay.
to kind of dedicate more effort to cold cases, violent crimes, this sort of thing. Since the whole Marcus Royal incident, the new chief who came in, I believe, June, his name is Joseph Lasada, he sort of recognized this as not being best practice, changed it back. Now investigators go to every death.
So there has been some reform. There's been changes as a result of this. This guy seems scary to me, though. I mean, this is a person who had a history of violence.
Mhm.
I believe he also had been convicted at some point or another, or some sort of record of sexual assault, that kind of thing.
Sure. He was accused of a crime at age 14. I think he ended up going to prison at maybe 15 or 16. He was convicted as an adult.
Wow.
And it sort of comes down to the Department of Corrections didn't really correct Marcus Royal. He gets out at age maybe 32, 33. It might have been his younger 30s, but...
and there was a wrinkle there, right? Because back when he was convicted, it was when there used to be gain time in Florida.
Sure,
You could earn time off for good behavior, and he apparently was...
He had a 27-year sentence and got out in like 15 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
So he's back in society after 15 years. You talked to his mother.
I did.
What did his mother say?
Very interestingly, she didn't, try to deny responsibility. She said, "I failed my son, but I didn't fail him alone." Marcus got out in his early 30s, really unprepared to take care of himself. As I understand it, he didn't know how to pay bills, didn't know how to function as an adult in society, and his mother says he wasn't really given the support that he would have needed to
He'd missed school,
reintegrate.
that's for sure, right?
Right.
Wow, and he was living in some mobile home or a camper or something like that?
Yeah, and in one of his court appearances, he said he had a little trailer or something.
And a child?
I'm sorry. Yes, he did. He did say that.
Okay. The family of either of the women, Faye Jones or Ann Mull, you talked to them and got their sense of. Well, I'm particularly curious about the first woman whose death had been treated as natural causes when
Right.
it turns out that it was a murder. What did they say?
Well, it appears they were suspicious of this from day one. I'm still sort of digging through exactly their correspondence, the victim's family's correspondence with police. But I mean, as of last week, the daughter was expressing, doubt that her mother had a heart condition, and kind of had qualms with the way this whole thing was handled.
But there's nothing.
Certainly thinks the police should have been more diligent.
Yeah.
But I believe is grateful that they are prosecuting her mother's alleged killer.
And they have answers. So now, what is his status right now? Marcus Royal status?
He's in Brevard County Jail.
Okay, awaiting trial on both of these
awaiting
cases?
trial on both these cases, as well as a Coco case. Similar deal where he broke into an older woman's house, took her money, so they say. Interestingly, that also was sort of a delayed, accusation. He was already in jail by the time they accused him of this crime from almost a year previous.
Is there any chance there could be other cases out there that he was involved with that we don't know about yet? I mean, could there be?
They say no, but it makes you wonder, I guess.
That's right. Okay. There was one part of your story where you recounted a court case, some kind of court hearing where he was accused of a crime, he'd been arrested, he's in front of a judge, the attorneys are having some kind of a bench conference with the judge, and he's heard saying, I want him to go home.
Right.
I find a way to get this guy to go home. Describe what was going on with that. What was up with that?
Well, Royal was due in court to enter a plea. This was for the theft. I think he had stolen some money from one of these Allied veterans' gambling places.
Okay.
This also violated his probation from that case in '93 when he was a kid.
We're somewhere in between the two killings that were the major.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So he was in and out of jail in between these two alleged murders. So he makes this speech where he says that he's trying and he made a mistake and he's sorry for what happened.
But he just goes too fast or something.
Right.
That
He says, I'm sorry, I moved too fast, is what it was. And the judge calls up the two attorneys. They had prepared to take a plea deal. I think they negotiated something like 37 months, maybe, about 3 years. And the judge says, I want him to go home. And it seemed to me that both attorneys were surprised that the judge would feel this way. And basically they worked it out that he would get credit for something like 140 days that he had been in jail awaiting this hearing.
Okay.
And then would be sent home in like a day or two. The court has said that this was a mutual, all parties agreed in negotiation. But if you go back and listen to the judge, it does seem that he's making his feelings pretty clear.
But he's pushing it. I think the interesting thing in Florida right now is that there are efforts in the legislature to reform sentencing, to lower some of the mandatory sentences, but it's not for people like this, not for people who have been involved in violent crimes and are, have a record of being potentially dangerous.
I think it's very important to point out that hindsight is 20/20, and if you sort of, when you're going to judge this judge, you have to sort of look at the information that he had in front of him. Nobody knew about this first murder, and no one knew that he was about to go out and kill again.
Nobody knew that he had killed anybody.
Right.
Okay, and he had spent 140 days
Right.
in jail already, awaiting for
Right.
what was a
theft.
A theft. Okay. Let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about what was probably one of the biggest trials in Brevard County in the last several years, and that was the trial of Brandon Bradley. And this is the man who was ultimately convicted of murder for shooting Deputy Barbara Pill in Melbourne during a traffic stop. My question was, it seemed like it was a foregone conclusion that he was guilty. Was it? Was there ever any question about his guilt in this trial, really?
Well,
what were the questions?
It seemed to me that the defense's strategy was to focus on the penalty phase, right? This is a two-part process where first they decide whether he did it or not, then they decide whether he deserves the death penalty. And I think they were banking or investing most of their time on that second part. So a lot of their questions to jurors during jury selection were things like, can you consider evidence of brain damage? Do you think drug addiction is a choice? Things like this, which seem to allude to this strategy of investing in the penalty phase. And then, of course, during the trial, they did bring out some psychologists and things like this to attest to his state of mind and this sort of thing. And then they brought out more of that, again, in the penalty phase. But I suppose you could say they were unsuccessful. The jury voted 10-2 to recommend a death sentence, and it seems very likely that that is what he's going to get. The judge is instructed to give that recommendation great weight, and I'm told it's pretty rare for a judge to deviate from that.
He was caught on video.
Right.
Was that video shown at trial? It
was not. They brought out I don't know, maybe a 30 or 40-inch TV and angled it away from the audience so the jury could see it. Those in the gallery could hear what was going on, but no, to my knowledge, it's never been publicly shown.
Well, I know Florida Today had pursued the video in court, and we were turned down by the judge in that case as well. I don't remember exactly the reasoning there, but it was difficult because in trying to go back and just find out what happened, that in this case, I think it was deemed to be a death record, like an autopsy report or something.
I've heard that. I've also heard that it would make it difficult for Bradley to get a fair trial if this was shown out in public, as well as do damage to the victim's family.
Right. Well, let's talk about that for a minute. And your impression in talking with attorneys, and we had an attorney who kind of acted as an analyst for you and for Florida Today and its readers during the time. Were there any questions that he got a fair trial?
His mother has questioned that. I don't know specifically what her concerns are, but she's made comments to the effect of there are things that didn't come out that maybe should have come out. You can look for that in follow-up. To me, sitting there, it was a lengthy and very careful process. It seemed to me that he got his fair shake in court. The judge asked him if he was satisfied with his attorneys. He said he was. So I think, yeah, he got about the best he could.
The attorneys seemed to do a pretty aggressive job of cross-examining witnesses in this case. At least that's the way it came across in the news copy. Did it seem that way to you?
It depends who you choose. Let's say this man, Jeffrey Dieguez, who, he basically lied on the stand about why he was in the hospital the first time police interviewed him. This was the man who was on the phone with Andrea Kirchner and said that he overheard comments Bradley was making about...
Kirchner was in the car with Brandon Bradley
on the phone
with
Jeffrey Dieguez.
this guy at the time of the shooting.
So they say, right. So he says that he overheard Bradley making comments which kind of go to premeditation. The defense was very aggressive in pursuing basically a lie that he made on the stand about the reason he was in the hospital the first time he was spoken to.
Why did he say that he was in the hospital?
He said he was in the hospital because he had been robbed and stabbed, I believe. And the real reason was that he had overdosed on cocaine, maybe intentionally, and was Baker acted.
I see.
Well,
that would
a
go
big difference, but
yeah. Well, I mean, they would certainly go to a witness's credibility, right?
But let's say there were many police witnesses where the defense didn't really have anything to say. It's just a guy who went into Pill's car and pulled out an SD card. There's not a lot to ask him about that.
What was the reaction to the verdict in the room?
It was a packed courtroom.
Lots of sheriff's deputies in there?
There were. I mean, it's hard to say. There was no weeping and wailing. It seemed that this was what people expected. Bradley certainly didn't seem fazed by what happened with the verdict. For that matter, pretty much the whole trial, he was stone-faced, not really showing any emotion. There was only one moment that he broke that and cried openly as his older brother described abuse they both suffered in their childhood.
Wow. Was that during the trial phase or during
That was during the penalty phase,
during the death penalty phase, when they were trying to present reasons why he was, I guess, mitigating factors or something like
Right.
that. Well, you know, that points to another issue that I thought was fascinating, was the defense brought in an expert about what the conditions would be like for Brandon Bradley in prison.
Mm-hmm.
And what did he say?
I think it's important to note that the judge did not allow the jury to hear that.
Okay.
But the defense was allowed to bring this guy out and get him on record for the purpose of appeal. So they have this so-called expert come out and trying to describe what life is like in prison, how a person serving life without parole in general population.
Who's his size, right? Who's
there was this
5'7",
interesting piece of theater
145 pounds or
where
something?
they made Brandon Bradley stand up, and then they had his much larger attorney stand up as a way of demonstrating that Brandon Bradley is a small man who would be preyed upon by larger inmates.
Also, he would, because he's a cop killer.
He would not get a lot of support from corrections officers.
I see. So, by contrast, he in the general population, he'd be subject to assaults, and I think they said that his stuff would be stolen, and he'd have a more comfortable life, or at least a more secure life, living on death row. Relatively,
yeah. They said that he'd have his own private cell, and he'd be able to have a TV and an hour outside to exercise, and he'd be relatively safe and secure. Again, the jury never heard this, but it seems that they were painting death row as a more pleasant place to be than out in general population with big, scary inmates.
Well, it certainly it offers insight to the viewers and to us, you know, to know what is ahead for this guy and where he will be spending probably at least the next 20 years while we wait for a death penalty to be appealed and the like.
It depends, yeah. I've heard average could be 12 to 17. It's something I'd like to check out, but I guess the law was recently changed that might streamline some of this appeals process.
I know that's something that Governor Scott was trying to do.
Right.
You did something different for Florida Today, and that was kind of what you see a lot on television, and you reached out, and we had someone doing courtroom analysis for us, an attorney himself.
Right.
Who was that?
Kepler Funk, a defense attorney from Melbourne, came in and sat in on a lot of the trial and was live tweeting right there next to me, which I think is a little different than how TV maybe does it. People seem to really like that. A lot of his commentary was helpful for me. I'm not a legal expert, so it was neat to get these little tidbits of trivia about the process and how this works and
strategy,
what to expect.
Right.
So I think it definitely enriched our live coverage and was very helpful for me as a reporter to understand what was going on.
Was there any takeaways from you in terms of legal lessons that you learned from Kepler Funk?
I mean, that's hard to say. I definitely found it very helpful. It's something I'll try to do again if I should find myself covering another trial. I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, I mean, to me, one of the more interesting things that I didn't know was that we were one of the few states that doesn't require a unanimous vote.
That's sort of what I mean,
these
neat little nuggets of information. Yeah, Florida does not require a unanimous vote. They just require a majority vote to recommend a death penalty. Kepler says every other state, except maybe Alabama, requires unanimity to recommend a death sentence.
Well, my prayers are with all the victims' families in both of your stories. How did you juggle doing two things like that? You have a front page major investigative type story with videos that we showed earlier in the program about the Morgan case. At the same time, you're in this trial, which you were covering really gavel to gavel. How do you do that?
It was a lot of hard work. Yeah, definitely a lot of juggling over the past 6 to 8 weeks. I had been working on the Marcus Royal story since about the time that that second indictment was released in December of last year. So I had a lot of my work done on that already. And sort of during the trial, it was mostly editing and polishing with two of the editors here.
Andrew Ford, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, that's our program for this week. My thanks to Florida Today reporter Andrew Ford for sharing a few moments of his busy day with us. Remember, you can publish your comment on his reports or any other story on this program by emailing us at letters@floridatoday.com. I'm Matt Reed. We'll see you right here next week on WEFS and FloridaToday.com.